Bien, muy buenas tardes a todos y a todas de nuevo. Por favor, si nos hacen el favor de tomar asiento, así empezamos esta última sesión de la tarde.
We're going to start this last session of the afternoon.
Pues buenas tardes, para mí es un auténtico honor.
It is really an honor for me to be here this afternoon, and I hope that this last session will be as interesting as all the other ones that we have been privileged enough to hear during the whole day. And again, thank you very much to the hosts of the Casa Árabe and the Adenauer Foundation, these two institutions that have convened us here today. In this last session of the seminar, which we call in a very general manner, perception and representation of the European Muslims. We'll listen in the first place Stefano Allievi. He is the director of the Master Studies about Islam at the Palma University. He is a professor for the history of religion, and he is the founder of the International Forum for Religion, and he is also participating in the big project about Islam. Then we'll hear Virtudes Téllez. She published a book in 2011 against the stigma, young Spaniards and young Moroccans fighting the stigmatization. So she's going to talk about youth and Islam here in Spain. She teaches at the University of Castilla-La Mancha and is part of a very important research team which does research about Muslim and Arab cities, and she cooperates with other research groups of the other Madrid universities and the Research Council of Spain. And to the other side, I have Aurora Ali. She defines herself as an activist, and she has a long career as such, but she is also responsible for the platform Citizens Against Islamophobia. This is a platform that has contributed to the sensitization of the Spanish society. She helps fight all sorts of hate speech, hate crime, aggressions against Muslims who live in our country. Part of that, she has worked in the legal world, and she is a specialist for renewable energies and has worked in Switzerland and in Egypt as well as in Spain. The topic we are going to discuss in a very express way, because we need to leave this room at 6:45.
Complicadas a las que se enfrenta Europa en la
actualidad. So Europe right now, and well, today we have been able to think aloud about the refugees, the asylum seekers, Islam. With very different, in very different contexts, but all these topics are part of a complex phenomenon. They all have to do with each other, and they are a bit like a puzzle, but we still think about a puzzle, and that is part of the problem. We have said this morning how the media in our European societies very often have difficulties when they report and inform about these different elements of this puzzle, and very often reality gets deformed and distorted. The observatory of the Islamophobia in the press within the foundation Al-Fanar, and with the participation of many well-known researchers and professors in Spain. Well, this observatory has said that 70% of the information about Muslims in Spain that have been published in Spain in the last 6 months have clearly Islamophobic content. 60%. So we are not talking about articles that have been written with this intention. Well, we can talk about the media later on. I'm not seeing them as a threat, but it is simply a fact that the tone of these articles in 60% of the cases of during these last months has been negative. So I think we should now listen to our speakers and then have a short debate. So Stefano has got the floor now. Yes, thank you very much for this invitation. I'm going to speak in English. I'll start with a quote in French, but which I myself will translate to Spanish then. It's a quote by Gustave Flaubert, Dictionnaire des idées reçues.
El diccionario de ideas recibidas. Y la citación dice simplemente, en francés antes, fondement, toutes les nouvelles en manquent. Fundamento, todas las noticias lo faltan. Es una... it's an extraordinary description of mediatization of Islam. There's no link often between the reality and the representation, or at least there is a huge gap among the two, between the two. And well, I start from a simple statement. It might seem impossible, but there has been a time not long ago in which Indo-Pakistanis in Britain were Indo-Pakistanis, Turks in Germany were Turks, and Moroccans in Spain were Moroccans. Now it is impossible not to consider them firstly as Muslims. But there has been a time not long ago in which they were not considered primarily as Muslims, and in Italy as well. I would say that the society in very few years has made the same path of sociology in 1 century. Sociology started to 1 century ago or so, studying society, and then people deviant from society, from normality, I would say. Then sociology started to study some form of otherness, internal minorities, for instance, the Jews, very typically, and then the immigrants, and then through the lens of race relations, for instance. And then the dimension of gender, so women, families, family ties, and then mixing, métissage, creolization, hybridization, and by the way, a category which is applied to everybody but Muslims. Muslims cannot creolize, cannot hybridize, cannot mix in a way. This is the impression. But the other, the diverse, the foreigner, the immigrant, and now the Muslim. There has been a semantic shift, I would say, and the selective perception. We perceive what is Muslim among Muslims, and we don't perceive the rest. Sometimes Muslims are also workers. Sometimes are fathers, mothers, sons. Sometimes, quite often, they are other things. They are straight or homosexual. They are whatever you want. They are leftists or conservatives. But they are always perceived as Muslim. And this is something that happens only about Muslims. So we have to understand which is the reason. It's very clear, if a Pakistani beat his wife, on the newspaper, there will be a Muslim beating his wife. If a Romanian beat his wife, it would not be an Orthodox beating his wife. And if a Spaniard beat his wife, it will not be a Catholic. So there is something in the perception that goes there, and we have to understand why. Not simply condemn it, but try to understand. It doesn't happen also for Muslims, also for Hindus, also for Jews, only for Muslims. And this is the paradox, and this happens exactly in the moment in which Muslims are less Muslims than before, in a way. That Islam in Europe is becoming Islam of Europe, is becoming a European Islam from many points of view. So I would say that on the one hand, we have the normality of immigration. The normality of immigration is often dramatic as well, but it's normal. And the exceptionality of the perception. There are historical reasons, true. There are geopolitical reasons, terrorism, obviously, yes, true. But all these started, for instance, much before September 11, not as a reaction, as it is often described, to September 11. It started before. So there is a symbolic overload, a social construction of fear that plays a crucial role. So the case of European Islam is interesting because from one side we have a presence of people who has to be considered definitive, irreversible. A lot of the movements against Muslims say, let them stay in their home. Well, the presence of Islam in Europe is irreversible, no question. But it's interesting that European Islam is going through at least two big changes, many. But I try to describe the two main issues in my idea, to my eyes. Islam is in evolution. Once I've been asked to describe in one word Islam in Europe. And I choose the word transformation, change. It's more than a quarter of a century, unlikely, that I study Muslims in Europe. And, well, I started 30 years ago, 28 years ago, 25 years ago. The situation was very different. Muslims, from many points of view, are not recognizable with the study we wrote 25 years ago. Is a reality in change and also of change. So when we study it, we have two temptations, I would say. One is reductionism, and the other one, the opposite one, is essentialism, I would say. Reductionism has been the reality of the studies on Islam in the first phase. Sociologists, anthropologists were putting Islam aside, religion aside. They were studying immigrant workers, race relations, all this kind of stuff. So they were not considered religious. And religious were not considered a social fact. The opposite way is the over-Islamization of Muslims, or in one way, the fact that you highlight religion as an interpretative tool, and this erase all the other factors. So if someone do something that comes from a Muslim country, it's because he is Muslim. And so the first way, the reductionism tends to individualize problems, and the essentialists tend to over-communitarize problem, I would say. Or there is always somewhere, even the use of the word community describing Muslim goes in this direction. A community, as if it be only one, for instance, which is not, obviously. And it works. It works also because it's more easy to describe things like that. I mean, and it also deals with academic rituals. You can make footnotes, etc. Because you start from books and not from reality, I would say. I always say I study Muslims, not Islam. And the difference is that Muslims can answer to questions, Islam cannot. We can talk to Muslims and they talk to us and not to Islam. So we can say whatever we want. On Islam, there will be no answer. This is a great advantage. Islam is static, possibly. I don't believe so, but anyway. Muslims are dynamic. Islam might be rigid. Muslims are flexible. Islam, some say, is univocal. Muslims are contradictory. They do declare, as everybody are, as everyone else, they declare things and they do different things, for instance. And and this is the dimension of change I think we have to study. And the two main dimensions of change, in my opinion, are the two ones. I describe them with two neologisms, if you want. Islam in Europe is a Meccan Islam, and the Ummic Islam, I would say. A Meccan Islam because, well, Islam, as you all know, starts when Muhammad went to Medina. In Mecca, it was a minority religion, which is not well seen in modern terms. The press was not very kind to it. He was a leader of a minority group in Mecca. In Medina, Islam became, in modern terms, religion of state religion. Well, Muslims coming to Europe has done the opposite travel, from a Muslim country to non-Muslim country, in which Islam doesn't rule, doesn't have a law, doesn't have tribunals, doesn't have courts, doesn't have etc. What does it mean? Even Sharia doesn't mean anything else. Fiqh need to be reinterpreted, and so on. It's a huge debate among Muslim groups. So what does it mean? That the dimension of change, new interpretation, new theologies, new whatever. I went several times to follow Yusuf al-Qaradawi in his tour as a pop star all over the communities in Europe. And I was surprised to see, you know, this huge speech of 3 hours and then a Q&A session with people asking things and he answering am I allowed to do this or that? And once I asked to a Muslim friend who was there with me, and they said, why they always ask the same questions 10 years after, 15 years after? And they said to me, you know why they always ask the same question? Because they always hope for a different answer. So orthopraxis has changed, but orthodoxy not yet. Is following, but slowly. It happens in Catholic milieu in the same way. Orthopraxis changes first, and then. And this is something, and the other aspect, which I call Ummic like that because I like it, is that the idea of internal plurality. The Ummah, in a global sense, is very plural. Well, local communities in Muslim countries are not plural. All the Muslims in the same mosque more or less are part of the same juridical school, madhab, the same tradition, interpretation. When the same person goes to Berlin, to Bradford, to Lyon, to Milan, to Madrid, they go to the mosque and they find people from 40 different countries, all the four madhabs and whatever, and that changes a lot. Because structurally, it produced as an acceleration of transformation. Plurality is in itself, structurally, not because it's their will, it's simply because it happens, because the internal diversity oblige you to ask yourself questions that you were not obliged to ask before, which is an extraordinary, and also a change in, again, once one of my interlocutor talking of madhabs and the necessity of having a fifth Sunni school interpretation of Islam in a minority fiqh or whatever. I was talking with a friend who is in London, but is of Yemeni origin and born in Africa. And he told me, we were talking about this, and he said, well, I am Shafi, but I have to follow the most common madhab here, which is the Hanafi one. Personally, as far as the Hajj is concerned, I am Hanafi. For jihad, I am Maliki. For the conception of minority, I am Hanbali. I mean, I am what I want to be. That's it, which is very interesting. So to go quickly, as far as I understand, Muslims in Europe are producing and asking for three different kinds of knowledge, I would say, Muslim knowledge or Islamic knowledge. A substantial part of population simply want to be progressively integrated or included or whatever you want to call it. And so they are like autochthonous religious people. Simply the second generation are like their parents, but a bit less. They pray, but a bit less. They go to mosque, but a bit less. They practice like Catholics, Protestant, Jews, etc. They secularize in a way in their behave and so on. So these kind of people do not ask for the new religious knowledge in a way. En gros. A second great tendency is traditionalist, I would say. They don't need a new production of knowledge, Islamic knowledge, because they have it. Because it is the knowledge of their country of origin, or the country of origin of their parents, and it is enough. So you want to be a good Muslim, you have to behave like your grandfather. That's it. Okay. So you bring your imam from, not from your country of origin, from your village of origin. It's a sort of anti-stress. What is Islam? What it has always been. Easy. Okay. It's inertial. Most of this part of the Muslim population receive a disproportionate media attention, because it's the one which is more easy to be in contrast with. They eat differently, they have gender relation differently, they are different. They don't learn the language, and so on. They marry differently, they educate their children differently, and so on. But there is a third part of the Muslim population in Europe, and it is the most interesting from many points of view, which is trying, starting from the fact of being European, being Dutch, being Belgian, to create a new interpretation of Islam from the minority point of view, the secular point of view, the pluralistic point of view. because they are European. But they are Muslims as well. And they do it. And it's very interesting. And we have we made the mistake to look only for theology texts, and there are. But if you look at associative milieu, simply the things that people say in their groups, you observe this tendency very well, very well. You cannot put in the footnote because it's not the title of a book, but it's a very common attitude. On the other side, perception, we have three ways of dealing with Muslims in Europe. One is very similar to others, as said, what I call reactive identities. Think to all the people who is rediscovering to be Christians since the moment that there has been Muslims. They didn't know before. They didn't know to be Christian. The huge success of Fallaci in Italy, Spain, etc. Fallaci detested Catholics. But from a certain moment on, there was some people in Europe that she detested more, Muslims. So she started to write things about how beautiful is the sound of bells, and so on. We have parties all over Europe that declare themselves identitarian, Christian, European, white, Western, etc., because they are against Muslims. If you ask something about Catholic Christian theology, they will, will say n'importe quoi. But they are part of this reaction, yeah. And these create conflicts. If I made once a list of the most common conflict on Islam, about Islam. Hijab, foulard, niqab, burqa, burkini, separate sport activities, swimming pool, mosques, minaret, use of Arabic in khutbas, imam, Quranic school, symbols, school, Christmas, halal butcher, whatever, mixed marriage, forced marriage, conversion, honor killings, censorship, etc. It looks like when we deal with Muslims, we deal with a conflict. So the overall perception is that Muslims are conflictual. The problem is most of these conflicts are not raised by Muslims. Terrorism is raised by Muslims, yes. Others are. Most of the other conflicts, homosexuality, are raised by others about Muslims. These are hermeneutical incidents, I call them sometimes, but okay. Mosques, minarets, okay. Another group of our public opinion in Europe simply accept pluralization as they have accepted technology. It happens. I don't like it maybe, but I need to deal with it. Okay. Like you accept that it's raining. Well, you prefer the sunny day, but it's raining. Okay, today I take the umbrella. There are others in the neighborhood. Okay, I'm not particularly enthusiast, but never mind. Okay, this is the second attitude. The third attitude, which is not present in the mediatization, is those who are interested in it, the proactive identities, not the reactive identities, which is hugely diffused. I mean, simply because you can choose, think to, well, what are we going to eat this evening? Tex-Mex, kebab, or pizza as usual? I mean, we can choose. We can choose the belly dancers, we can choose, etc. I often use the mixed marriage as an example. In many cities in Italy, mixed marriages as a flow this year, last year, represent mixed marriage 15, 20%. That means that 15, 20% of people don't dislike diversity. On the contrary, they like the diversity at the point that they marry it. So it's much more complex. I go to the conclusion, I skip a lot of things about Islamophobia, etc. To go to the very, very last, which is this. Well, I don't use often the term Islamophobia because it's not a phobia, it's not a fear often. It's more honest to describe it as a hate. I detest Muslims. I don't fear Muslims, I detest them. A lot of people do like that. It's different. It's not less severe, it's not less problematic. But if Islamophobia is the fever, it's a fever, it's not the illness. And the fever is often, I am optimistic and from this point of view, the fever can become very high. And I think that in Europe is not as much higher as it will be in next years. But at a certain point, it goes down for two reasons. Either the patient dies, or simply, more often, there's no more the illness. So I have the feeling, having observed conflict about Muslims in Europe for a lot of time, that from a certain point of view, dealing with conflict and be conflictual is the way a lot of people have to digest diversity and Islam. I would conclude, and Muslims, I would conclude saying that from many points of view, I would say that Islam is a discursive substitute of something else, of pluralism. Europe has changed enormously. It is much more culturally, religiously pluralistic than it has ever been. But this debate is not a debate in society. Our constitution, most of them, has been written with the presupposition of homogeneity. We are not anymore homogeneous societies, and we would not be homogeneous as a society even if immigrants would not exist, because there is an internal cultural pluralization. Think of family models, how they have changed in very few years. There is no more a compulsory family model. There are many. This is cultural diversity. So Islam, as far as I see, and I described the reason in my paper, is a substitutive discourse, or in psychoanalytical term, a transitional object. The transitional object is I finished, to give an example, is chocolate. You have a problem, you need to be loved, so you eat chocolate, okay. You need to discuss pluralism, but because there's no occasion to discuss that, you discuss Islam and Muslim, thinking that it is the extreme case of diversity, which is not, by the way. It's much more similar, even from the religious point of view, than other religions or than other cultural, subcultural group inside the society. And I will stop on that because I understand that you want me to stop. So, okay, thanks a lot.
Muchas gracias, Stefano. Yo coincido mucho contigo en el diagnóstico y, bueno,
Stefano, I agree a lot with you on the diagnosis. I apologize for interrupting you. We could spend the whole afternoon, but we haven't got enough time, so now I give the floor to Virtudes. Well, good afternoon. I'd like to start by thank you for your invitation, particularly because of what I'm going to say regarding the representation of the people that I've been working with, which is the Madrid Islamic youth. So I'm going to focus on a practical experience, and it's going to be an overview of the 10 years that I've dedicated to my research study as an anthropologist. I worked for 4 years on the research study, but I saw that throughout these 10 years, these specific practices have been represented in different ways, and I've also observed on a later work that what happens, it seems like when I leave the field, this other person joined, and so we managed to do a longitudinal, so to speak, analysis of 10 years. We can see somehow at a popular level, in the academia and the media, we see how the social-political participation that I'm going to talk to you about is represented. I mean, the Muslim boys and girls. These are youngsters that are viewed in the public spaces in different ways in a very complicated moment of the Spanish society in two specific times, that is in the terrorist attacks in 2004 and then the so-called movement of the 15th of March, the group of annoyed citizens, those who revolted against the current system. This is a representation, and I'm going to use an English term, which is misrepresentation. We wouldn't use this term in Spanish normally, but it indicates how this group is not represented. The political participation of this group is not mentioned at all. The idea was, however, to create an association on youth and the risk of radicalization and security policies, which would aim to control those practices that are considered to be associated to violence, to radicalization, etc. But the whole situation doesn't show, or shows it in a distorted, or shows in a distorted way these other forms of representation. So I'd like to give you a description of the people that I'm talking about. These are boys and girls. As part of our context, we're going to say that they are young, but there's a wide range of age, between 18 and 35 years old. But they are young because they have, they feel young because they have certain socio-economical conditions that allow them to be young. Maybe because they lack economic independence, because they lack access to housing or situations like this. What they have shown is that if before we were talking about the Muslim population always in association to migration or migration phenomena, then since they occur and they start to create associations since 2004, they show a profile of different Muslims, because these people have been born here in different places of Spain, even though they were based in Madrid at the time. And what they want to convey is that they are going to have behavior that is similar to that of the rest of the citizens, because they understand that they have worked on the possibility of living together with the civil society, the Madrid society, and also with a specific religious society, that is the Islamic society. What we observe at the time is their presence in those examples of where they show their pain, their grief after the attacks.
They then become more visible, and they showed that there shouldn't be a relationship between violence and a specific religion. From this public action, the other associations emerged. And despite the fact I'm talking here about a couple of hundreds of people in these 10 years, I know that it is very important that from a statistical point of view, there was a small figure. I know we talked this morning about the figures of Muslims in Spain. Talked about a total of 2 million. Those that are Hispanic and Muslims, we think there might be about 800,000 citizens. 430,000 of those are descendants of Muslims. The fact that statistically they are not very representative, it doesn't mean that they haven't had a weight in this change, and they are also sending us a message. They are asking us to reconsider the way we understand Muslim people. From a geographical border that would be marked by the place of origin of the relatives, a border that ends up becoming a symbolic border. I'm now kind of thinking about someone like Bauman, as how he would define this. And also we continue reproducing an association between foreign elements, an association between a culture and a country and a population. We assume those as foreign elements that are going to be questioned. With the fear of being attacked and knowing that they could be defined as suspects, they decide to be more trained in their religion and make the religion more obvious in order to understand, or they understood that by showing their practical example, their example and behavior could be questioned, but they linked with other associations in Madrid, movements that are not religious, of a religious type, that reflected on this idea of categories that were assigned from outside. What is it to be a good Muslim, for example? Or what is it to be a good citizen? And they also organized leisure activities. They used to gather and reflect and discuss things. But the practices were of a local scope. And I wanted to show the representation in the media of all this issue. The days after the attacks, the media presented this example. But after the years, this movement became a bit lost. It wasn't discussed anywhere. And then there was a group of the girls of this association decided to participate in a TV documentary on a public channel. So instead of talking about their links with the transnational movement, by which they had a social and political participation, the way they were represented was as a group of girls that made a trip to Granada. From the comments in that TV documentary, there was a reaction by a group of Muslims who criticized what they had said. And because of the link with the mosque, where they had been trained, where they presented their religiousness, there were they were told to be Wahhabis. And with regards to that transnational movement, made their discourse of the link between Madrid and religion and etc. was shown. The link was actually through relationships with other Arab youngsters from Arab countries. From that, we observed a crisis. And after that first phase of 4 or 5 years, the whole situation is renewed thanks to this movement of the 15th of March. The people that were upset with the system and annoyed with the system, and how they define themselves. They want to revert the stigmatization amongst the Muslim youth. They also requested the recognition of their citizenship. And as this part of the second phase, we can see a direct participation as citizens, without questioning, without demanding that recognition, through their link with the Syrian cause and humanitarian aid and different protests, etc., related to the recognition of the Syrian cause. They request another, and they have another way of participating. This becomes silent. Everything I'm telling you, this becomes silent in the academic projects. There are only 2 ethnographic research projects that have been done by my colleague and myself. And what prevails are the reflections around security, radicalization, from the field of psychology. Psychology and political sciences, both. But it doesn't show what these practices mean. Hence, there's a triple answer in the lack of visibility of these ways of participation. From the Spanish administration, there is no mention of them. They are actors who try to have a position, they have to try a public voice as Muslims. However, they continue, or we continue to work with the older generations. From the community itself, this is understood as a young answer. It's not going to have a continuity in time. They don't really get a lot of credibility, and they don't think it's going to have an institutional impact. And from the academia, the different culture ends up misrepresenting these youngsters that decide to have a participation, which wouldn't be a problem. It would be just part of the reactions of the social and cultural associationism and the youth associations in the autonomous community of Madrid. And most of the members of these groups were women, they were girls, and nowadays the evolution is quite similar. And if we analyze if we do a search, a simple search on Google on those associations, it's not a protest, it was just a small sound. It strikes to see that it seems like the message that they convey is misrepresented, but what gains protagonism is that all those articles related to the link of certain young Muslim girls, the link between these girls and the ISIS. And also it highlights the need of paying attention to the role of women in this type of commitment. The prosecutor of the National Court, Mrs. Delgado, who is an expert on jihadist terrorism, says that women are more participative, and in many cases radicalization may depend on them. So they go from being secondary members to become the protagonists of the encouragement, the promotion of radicalization. All of a sudden, the youth were suspicious at the beginning as young boys. It is shared with the girls now, and what I'd like to say that these media attitudes and these academic researchers don't include the gender Islamophobia. Bearing in mind that ethnical and racialized stigmatization, the negative approaches act as oppression forms. They are, bearing in mind that they're rooted in certain specific discourses, then we see that in this analysis women can turn out to be violent or repressed, and also themselves victims of oppression from other Muslims. It is a form of representation that means that these other socio-political forms of participation, which would be part of the participation of other citizens, are not shown, and they indicate violence, structural type of violence towards these girls through their lack of visibility. And the answer to this is done through a religiousness, where the image of the body is very important, not just an indicator of a stigma, but also as the space in which to incorporate and show the values and the principles and the conceptions of the Islam in order to question that stigma itself. So when it is talking about that lack of visibility, that misrepresentation, the show of the evidence of those internal borders represented by the ethnical, political, and religious and social aspects, what we see is, once again, that lack of visibility of the way they have decided to participate as citizens, and we see that that is an attempt to avoid questioning the association between the girls and the boys. And they're not there is not enough effort to avoid those stereotypes. However, what I think is that if I can access the works that we have done and etc., I think it would be interesting to consider how we should open up a discussion to question these hegemonic forms of representation of the Muslim youth, in this case the Muslim youth in Madrid or in Spain, and also a discussion on how to include these in the representation of the civil society. So it's not as a foreign element, but as we have said already, as like Ana Terron said at the beginning of the morning, just avoiding the foreign aspect of the generalization. We should basically do this when we talk about the Muslim youth, a group that only gets our attention when we want to talk about radicalization and violence, and they don't get our attention when we want them to have a more normalized visibility.
Esto que indicabas, ¿no? Son poco representativas en términos numéricos, ¿no? Estas mujeres.
Thank you so much. You are right that from a point of view of the numbers, there are not very many Muslim women here in Madrid, and there are very few that put fire to themselves. Of course, I don't want to compare civil actions and terrorist acts, but there are different ways of trying to face certain challenges.
Hola, buenas tardes a todas y a todos.
Well, good afternoon. What I will say will be a little bit different. I'm going to try to give you a certain photography of this point in time about Muslims in Spain. A colleague of ours also participating in the platform and talking about the diversity against this cliche that all Muslims are the same. Can be quoted as saying this: the Islam in Spain is very diverse, and if it is perceived as basically under the influence of the Arab countries, this is a cliche that is simply not true, and certainly not true of all the young Muslims in Spain. And if this image is being preserved, there is a political interest behind it, and this is a quote from 25 years ago, from the year 1992. There are certain agreements, the agreements of the year 1992. Here, for example, something to do with the young people and the right to religious teachings at school. The Muslims are 4% of the students at schools, in the same way that the Muslims make up 4% of the Spanish population. For those 92,000 students, there are 55 teachers available, which means that the large majority of Muslim kids at school cannot have any religious education at school. I'll go on talking about the minors. Here, for example, we see the bullying at school, harassment, particularly after the attacks, of the terrorist attacks, and again also the women and the minors as the main victims of these tendencies. And then in the agreements of the year 1992, the right to halal food is being denied, but not only that, even the right to eat daily food without pork meat is not being granted. And then here we have the image of the mother who then goes to protest in the school, and again she suffers discrimination. First of all, her child, and when I go and protest, then again the answer is negative. So all these things have to be negotiated, and that comes at a price. And Then another refusal is to allow the girls to wear the headscarf at school. And in some schools, they are not admitted if they wear the headscarf, or they are admitted, but they are told that on the following day they will not be allowed to wear it. We have to bear in mind that some of them are little girls, but very often, also at a later stage, when they're adolescents, they want to wear the headscarf out of their own initiative, and the parents keep telling them, well, you have to adapt, education is more important, and they are the ones who insist. In reality, the Spanish law says, well, education has to take precedence over other norms of a lower range within the hierarchy. But all these things should be solved peacefully. Locally, there is certain progress. For example, in Valencia, the regional education ministry has established that nobody can be denied the right to education, no matter whether they wear a headscarf or a kippah or a hijab. And there have been certain achievements around halal food in schools in La Rioja. So I've started with the worst scenario on this photo I'm taking, and gradually things are improving. Now, another topic is Muslims and communication. There are Muslim journalists, but very few of them are employed at a journal or a newspaper. Most of them are work freelance. In our channel, we've given some of them work, but they are normally not recruited. They are only recruited when we deal with topics that have to do with Islam, or when there is a terrorist attack. We, in the normal television, only remember our Muslim contacts and colleagues when we want to inform about Muslim topics. So, for example, when there is a terrorist attack, or when there has been a conflict in a school around the headscarf or similar topics. But in all our talk shows in radio and television, there is never a Muslim participant. We only call them to talk about Muslim clothes, Islamophobia, or terrorism. But during Ramadan in 2016, the Spanish Muslim communities, well, we are all very fragmented from a geographical point of view. So there are many small communities of us, and in each of these small communities during the Ramadan of the year 2016, small little celebrations were held together with the non-Muslim neighbors, and there has been a good coverage in the media of these convivial activities. And as to the trial after the terrorist attacks in Barcelona, and then the when these terrorists who had survived were finally sentenced, there were many gatherings, peaceful gatherings in memory of the victims together between Muslims and non-Muslims. But later on, again, there was certain violence when we hold roundtable discussion about bullying of Islam kids at school, and suddenly in the audience there was a certain aggression and hostility, and everybody was wondering why. And then somebody in the audience said, "They have killed in the name of Allah. They have killed in the name of Allah," and without letting Muslim participants say anything. And then 3 days later, there was an interview in television in very racist terms, and that was really noticeable. Well, an interview with Muslim participants in a very racist tone, but it was so bad that measures were taken, and then these same participants were invited to a new interview, and this interview was conducted in a reasonable way, and the Muslim participants were allowed to talk freely. And now a few examples of really unacceptable terminology. This is an image of things that have been said in Téllez, which is my station, could be any other. And it says, for example, that the FBI has denied that the Islam that a mass murder has been perpetrated by Muslims without any other explanation. Also, the 2.5 million of Muslims who live in Spain are not described as belonging to different nationalities. And now a few words about politics. These are Muslims who are active in politics in Spain. There are many more names. I haven't had time. And we find them particularly in the media at a local level, most of them in Ceuta and Melilla, where there is the highest concentration of Muslims. Practically 50% of the population there is Muslim. I think it was in Great Britain where David Cameron talked about the Islamic State in public, and there was a turmoil in the parliament because there were Muslims who had sensitized their colleagues, and it was agreed that this terminology could not be handed over to a group of terrorists. If there is 4% of us, then we should be represented in the parliament in the same proportion. So yes, we are in politics, but only at a local level, and that is simply not enough. In other public spaces, there are more Muslims, but we still do suffer from discrimination for being Muslims, for wearing a headscarf, for having certain names, and so on and so on. But there are civil servants among us, politicians among us, teachers among us, so we are part of the society, and we are useful for the Spanish society. So to come to an end, what would our advice be as to good practices? Well, first of all, it would be important to normalize our different biographies, the description of us, accept the fact that the society is diverse, that it is not rare for a kid at school to be Muslim, to be homosexual, or whatever. And the civil rights should be respected and enlarged, and then we should try to achieve proportionate representation of Muslims in all the spheres of public life.